Okay, welcome to the Socialist Legacy. I'm Reed Kane. You're watching us on the Sublation Media Twitch channel if you're watching live. We stream every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Join us live if you can to contribute to the conversation. I also upload these videos to YouTube and SoundCloud as a podcast after the fact, so you can follow us there. If you're watching live, you want to catch up with past episodes. I am still a little bit behind on those uploads, so I apologize, but I will catch up. I've just been busier than usual lately. So I don't have as well defined an agenda today. I think we'll be a little bit looser with the structure. If anything comes up and you'd like to intervene with a question or a comment, if you're watching live, please definitely do so. But to begin, I just wanted to plug a few articles that I have recently read that I think are really great, worth reading. Most of them in Sublation magazine itself. So first of all, and I'll include links to these in the video description if you're watching on YouTube. First and foremost, there is an article that was published at the beginning of July by Chris Catrone in Sublation magazine called Dogmatization and Thought Taboos on the Left. And there's also a kind of corresponding piece that Catrone published in Compact magazine, another kind of relatively new magazine that's sort of a right social democrat magazine in a way. That one is called The End of Millennial Marxism. Those are both really great, really helpful articles. I definitely recommend checking those out. Also, more recently, Sublation published an article by Ralph Leonard called Socialism and Self-Defense about the Second Amendment and the kind of revolutionary legacy of the right to bear arms and its relationship to left politics and socialist politics. Really great article. And he also was on the I think Chris Catrone was on the Sublation YouTube channel discussing his article with Doug earlier in the month. And then just yesterday or a few days ago, Ralph was on the Sublation the Sublation magazine show on the YouTube channel there to discuss his article with Doug. So those are all things that are definitely worth checking out. If you haven't seen them, I would comment on these pieces in more depth, but I fundamentally agree with everything there. I don't think there's a whole lot to bring up, in terms of like things that are worth delving into on the level of what I usually do on this channel or in these streams, which is sort of kind of go into the underlying history that is presupposed by, but often neglected or misunderstood or misrepresented in contemporary socialist discourse, as well as just kind of looking at pieces of that history on their own terms. One last article, or actually, well, there's two more, but one that I'll just mention in passing, an article also in Sublation magazine by Will Stratford called The Circular Logic of Bhaskar Sankara, which I think originally had a different title, but I'm not sure if there was some kind of controversy about that. But in any case, title aside, it's a great piece, and it's very much in line with some of the criticisms of Sankara and Jacobin and DSA that I've made on this channel previously. A lot on that note, so I've mentioned in previous streams, and several of the previous streams have been devoted to kind of working out the arguments of an article I've been working on that I hope to see published in Sublation when it's finished, criticizing the Seth Ackerman's model for a new party and the kind of Jacobin, kind of broader Jacobin perspective on party politics. That article, I was intending originally for it to be a relatively succinct argument about Ackerman's plan in particular, and it got a little bit it became a little broader than I originally intended. And between that and some of the things going on in my personal life, I haven't been able to complete it yet, but it's almost finished. It should be finished within a week or so. But in the meantime, Will's article is a really great kind of expression of of the sort of the essence of the argument I'm kind of making there, although in a somewhat different direction with a somewhat different target. So yeah, check all of those out. One more article in Sublation that I'll bring up and I'll talk about it in a little bit more depth. I think was published today actually, is called "No Shortcuts: The Struggle for the Revolutionary Party," and it's attributed to I'm not sure how to say this, Szamuely, which I must assume is a nom de plume or maybe a nom de guerre. But in any case, it's a brief and pretty interesting article. Again, somewhat along similar lines to some of the arguments I've been making here and the criticisms of Bhaskar Sankara that Will Stratford makes in his article. But it's got a little bit more of a kind of sectarian tinge to it. Certain formulations have sort of the flavor of kind of certain Trotskyist and even certain Maoist, or at least kind of, you might say, Sinophilic strains of Trotskyism. So I'm not sure what the background of the author is. He certainly, or they, I'm not sure, whoever this author is, certainly seems to have a certain degree of antipathy for sectarianism in general, broadly conceived. So both the kind of traditional sectarianism in the traditional sense of kind of ultra left, a kind of an ultra left position that isolates itself from the real movement by virtue of its sort of doctrinaire or dogmatic insistence on its theoretical or programmatic standpoint. But also what following Hal Draper, as we discussed in a previous episode, Hal Draper has a kind of broader conception of sectarianism, which he actually gets from Marx, that has to do not simply with that sort of doctrinaire or dogmatic character, but a more general relationship, a more general kind of orientation or relationship of socialists to the working class and the working class movement and the organizational expression that relationship takes. Basically, what Draper a little earlier in his career was criticizing as socialism from above, as opposed to socialism from below, although those are terms that he kind of doesn't, he kind of alters his terms a little bit in the 70s, which is when he wrote some of the articles that I've drawn upon previously. Mainly, I think, because the language of socialism from below became very abused and distorted by certain currents in the New Left, specifically in the SDS, that were influenced by Draper and arguably sort of misunderstood and kind of distorted what he was actually talking about. But that's a point for another time. So this author of this article, Szamuely, I suppose, has a kind of, so let me read a little bit of this article just to give you a sense of where they're coming from. And it's really, I think it's pretty well written. It's got a really nice bite to it in terms of its sort of rhetorical flourishes, critical, satirical flourishes. It's good. It's nice. And ultimately, I kind of agree with the broad gist of it. But I think it's I think it's a brief article, to be fair. I don't want to kind of indict the author for writing, a relatively condensed statement of a broader position. But I do think that when push comes to shove, when he or they arrive at the crux of the argument, where the kind of criticism really counts, it's a little too vague to kind of follow through. It kind of misses the mark by virtue of being too vague in like the essentials of the argument. So let me just read a little bit of this just to give you a sense. It should come as no surprise that in a moment at the long tail end of 4 decades of defeat for the workers' movement, kicked into overdrive by the collapse of the Eastern Bloc party states, the question of how to build the Revolutionary Party is hardly fashionable. Most of those who claim fidelity to Marxism find various ways to sidestep it indefinitely. Building a revolutionary party may be a necessary task, they say, but it is one for a hazy future, always just over the horizon. For now, they find themselves comfortably ensconced on the fringes of political parties, which are hardly working class, let alone revolutionary. Many of them have been there for decades, and we can scarcely expect them to reverse course now. For such people, it has never been and never will be the right time to begin building a revolutionary workers' party. Entrism, once a tactical maneuver, is very different in very different times, has become a way of life and a point of pride. I always bristle a little bit when people refer to involvement in the Democratic Party, which is implicit in what is being discussed here, I think. He doesn't mention the Democratic Party outright, but I think it's pretty clearly at least one of the targets. Socialists and later on DSA does come up, socialists working within the Democratic Party in some form. I always bristle a little bit when that's referred to as entrism, because entrism, I think, has a much more specific connotation of the relationship of an organized tendency external to a socialist party or communist party or working class party, entering into that party from without rather than developing within it originally. And say what you will about Ackerman's whole kind of argument, he definitely has a point that the Democratic Party, and for that matter, the Republican Party, aren't really political parties in the same sense that we would talk about like a working class party, a workers' party, or a labor party, let alone a revolutionary party of some kind. It's and for that, I think where I differ with Ackerman on that point is that it's precisely the fact that they aren't really political parties in that sense that makes it necessary to not work within them, as it were. I mean, I think there would, if anything, be more of a justification to work within those sorts of parties if they had the kind of democratic membership structure that Ackerman, for one, sees as a criterion for a genuine political party. Okay, so I could just kind of keep reading through here, but just to summarize a little bit. So there's a shot fired at the sort of this kind of socialists that acknowledge the necessity of building a party, but for the time being are content to kind of ride on the tail of the Democratic Party or the Labor Party or some other party like that. And then the author goes on to criticize the sort of sectarian, the kind of now increasingly kind of, invisible, disintegrating, but still somewhat present sectarian approach of maintaining revolutionary continuity, not by virtue of kind of rebuilding or, reconstituting the old revolutionary parties, in some way, but by kind of hanging on to the right idea of the right tendency that splintered off from one of those parties at some point in the past. As well as the kind of left unity approach of just kind of getting together, various different tendencies under a broad front. So the argument is essentially, so to kind of the argument is kind of set up as a criticism of the full sweep of different perspectives, different approaches on the left or the socialist left. Essentially saying all of them in different ways avoid a task that they all, nonetheless, they're all willing to admit the necessity of this task, but they all either put it off or otherwise avoid it, and have some sort of kind of rationale for avoiding it, and doing something else in the meantime. And so essentially the argument is we need to just get down to business and actually build this party that we think is necessary. So that's where I think the weakness of the argument comes out. And so let me read one more little paragraph here, where I think you can kind of see the weakness start to come through. And this is under the heading, "The Task Ahead." Right. So to work in the line of party construction in America in 2022 is to build Marxist circles within the labor movement, which combine a rigorous study of the classics, an intensive investigation of the economic realities of the present, and a militant engagement in the daily struggles of our class. Such a course precludes either subordinating oneself to the pink liberalism of the DSA as the most cutting-edge transmission belt of the bourgeoisie in the labor movement. So that's a little kind of Trotskyism there. Or joining one of the dwindling relics of the old sectarian left. It means having the courage and the determination to strike out on your own or with a handful and begin to train yourselves as labor militants and communists through study and action. This is because 4 decades of ceaseless attacks on the working class have broken the old continuities. So 4 decades, so since the 80s. Interesting periodization there, but moving on. So skipping ahead a few sentences, if we are able to begin serious work and start afresh, we will not be encumbered by the junk of the past, but it is an advantage we can draw upon only on the condition that we seriously take up our task. It is a task that can be taken up anywhere. Unite those who can be united around a Marxist policy of study and action, inside or outside of the existing unions. Embark on organizing for struggle somewhere on the long front between workers and capital, which constitutes our society. And within this struggle, begin to train an intellectual elite that is able to independently grasp the dynamic of the revolution from 1776 to 1917. Again, an interesting formulation there. There's certain, it springs to mind certain tendencies that might formulate it that way. But again, who can say, given the anonymity of the author, and what that demands of them today, what that demands of this intellectual elite today, what the dynamic of the revolution demands today. This means building real social force through action. Strikes, walkouts, struggles for union recognition, and struggles for union democracy, in conjunction with real ideological cohesion. No superficial unity for the sake of unity, but a precise and unsparing discussion of all the questions we have inherited from the prior history of the workers' movement, and a constant struggle for dialectical materialist clarity against all eclectic combinations with bourgeois philosophy. Okay, so it kind of goes on like that a little longer. And so, Clint, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but just to kind of put a point on where I'm at with this, it sort of leaves me wanting at exactly the point where I want, where I'm looking for something substantive. I'm with you on the argument that we should take seriously the task of building a party. But of course, people have been trying to take that task seriously for over 100 years, and in the second half of the 19th century, up to the early 20th century, people were taking that task who were taking that task seriously were successful at it, namely the parties of the Second International and to some extent the parties of the Third International in its early years. In maybe a more qualified sense. I actually, on that point, so I did click on the author's name on the Sublation page, and the bio that came up, the only piece of identifying information was that the author obsessively reads the proceedings of the Third International. Presumably the first four congresses of the Third International that most Trotskyist tendencies recognize as kind of a sort of foundation for their political perspective. So, yeah, it sort of leaves me wanting at exactly the point that I want the argument, right? Which is, I'm with you on the criticism, but how do we overcome the failures of efforts to build the party that were undertaken over the last 100 years? Because all of the various strains that he mentions, or that they mention, the kind of people tailing the Democrats, the socialists that tail the Democrats, the socialists that hole up in these decrepit sectarian organizations and claim to be preserving revolutionary continuity, and the sort of unity mongers that are kind of trying to fuse together whatever remnants of the old traditions of left that they can. All of these are the result of efforts to do exactly what the author is recommending, namely to pursue a policy of study and action inside or outside the existing unions, to combine a rigorous study of the classics. Of course, what are the classics? What is the canon that we're invoking here? There's all sorts of controversies on that. I mean, even if we're all Marxists, there's not agreement on which works of Marx should be regarded as the classics that deserve priority over others, let alone whether even Engels should be counted, or, forget about Lenin and Luxemburg and Kautsky and Trotsky and, others, and then even later, Stalin, Mao, whatever, right? So what classics? Of course, every tendency of socialism, Marxism, even anarchists have their classics, right? Even anarchists who Marxists say have no theory and who will often themselves, defer argument by way of, arguments against classical anarchist texts by saying, well, anarchists don't, have any authority, and I don't have to defend, Proudhon or Bakunin or whatever. So combining rigorous study of the classics and intensive investigation of the economic realities of the present. I mean, come on, every sectarian tendency has done this for 100 years. Go through any of the old newspapers, and even today they do this. And it's not just the sectarians. I mean, there's an entire academic branch of academic Marxism devoted to trying to do these sorts of economic analyses. And militant engagement in the daily struggles of our class. I mean, maybe not with great success in every instance, but which tendencies of the socialist movement or fragments of the socialist movement over the last 100 years was not attempting to do just this in whatever ways it could. Sometimes with some success, generally not with a great deal of success, certainly not a sufficient amount of success. But one way or another, what the author is insisting upon, which is like getting down to the serious work and not engaging in these get-rich-quick schemes, one or another of these get-rich-quick schemes, which is not how I would characterize it, really. maybe, I suppose the the DSA, or more generally this orientation towards the Democratic Party, you could look at it that way. But really, if you like the way that Bhaskar Sankara, for example, talks about it, is not some sort of get rich quick scheme, but as like, we're in such a desperate position that we have to resort to doing this because there's no other way forward. And even if we succeed in doing what we're trying to do, it's only going to create conditions for then doing what you're insisting upon later, right? So, Bernie gets elected president and Corbyn gets elected, becomes prime minister, and they try to pass some social democratic reforms, and it creates some sort of major conflict in society, which will require the masses to rally behind them. And then they might bring enough pressure to pass some of these reforms. But even that would then provoke an even further crisis, which would require further radicalization. I mean, it's overwrought, but it's certainly not the idea that like this is going to get us right to socialism or something. Not at all. At least, I mean, maybe not everyone affiliated with DSA has that level of, puts that level of depth into their their political orientation, but it's certainly there in, you might say, the leading lights in those circles. So yeah, I mean, it's just, and for that matter, the left unity thing is also, it's not a get rich quick scheme so much as it is a kind of attempt to deal with a desperate situation in which they can't do what they would like to immediately do, right? They would like to just, I mean, everyone that proposes left unity has some perspective that they think is the right perspective, that they admit they disagree with the other people they're trying to unify with, in trying to unify with them, but that they're willing to kind of set aside for the purposes of building an organization that will ultimately benefit the perspective that they're trying to advocate. And for God forbid any sectarian thinks that they're trying to, they're all in it for the long haul. But okay, Clint, I've rambled long enough. What do you think about all that?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it shows the difficulty of, well, it raises the question of what is the function of a Marxist intellectual today,
right?
Because he's able to provide, or the author of this piece is able to provide, what you're calling these various get rich quick schemes in and around the DSA, but then more or less recapitulates what people in the DSA are already doing. I mean, there are people trying to proletarianize themselves, enter the labor unions, form study groups,
the rank and file strategy,
rank and file, the Marxist Unity Caucus, and so it comes down to this this needing to tether theory or taking theoretical or historical stock of where we are to an immediate practical deliverable. Like, okay, and therefore we're going to be doing this. And so, like, obviously, that's there is that intrinsic changeability of the world. Otherwise, we are, just doing metaphysics or whatever. But it brings to bear, like, what it would mean to grasp how exactly we should think about the problem that we're in. So I'm reminded.
My wife in the background. Sorry.
Hello.
Hi, honey.
The car keys.
Oh, the car keys. Sorry. Sorry.
No worries at all.
There you go. Love you.
Nice
little domestic moment there.
Those are always good to have. Keep us real.
Yeah. Sorry, Clint. You were saying.
I guess so. I'm so yeah. On the one hand, like the practical deliverable that's coming out of this critique right now, is just kind of recapitulating what's going on within the DSA and around the DSA, anyways. And so on the other hand, I'm sort of reminded, just to kind of tie it back to some of the discussions that we have been having, it's with the after the failure of 1848. And Marx is with the exiles in London, and all of the other, exiles. They say the revolution is ongoing, and they think that like all of this, and it's precisely because Marx is saying no, this revolution is dead. Long live this revolution. That he's able to actually take theoretical stock of what this moment is historically about, and what's that, so what does it mean that the French Revolution is actually now degenerating? And so obviously we're at a much more regressed moment today, but the need on the one hand to immediately tie thinking, to the very same practical imperatives that have ground us down for the past century. I think so. That's the immediate obstacle that's sort of just like present there in the piece. And so what kind of object are we actually facing with the DSA being the only expression of socialism in the 21st century?
Yeah, and I think, so I would also say with regard to that, there's a certain, what the author is recommending here. I mean, of course, they're right, that this is what needs to be done. The studying the classics does need to. I mean, that's what the Socialist Legacy Project is. That's what this is essentially about, right? That's what I'm trying to do here. I certainly think that's necessary. In terms of the economic investigations of President, this economic analysis or whatever is, I think at present that's not really so important or useful. Although I'm not going to try to stop anyone from doing it. If you want to do that, that's fine. I just don't really see the utility in the present of that sort of thing. And frankly, I'm skeptical of the merits of a lot of what comes out of this sort of attempt to do economic analysis right now. And going back, I mean, I've read a lot of this stuff certainly in the Trotskyist press over the 20th century and also the early Communist Party press, and it just doesn't really. I'm sure it had a different resonance in the moment when it was written, although maybe not exactly the resonance that the authors might have hoped. But that's not really, I think, what's essential right now in terms of where we're at. What good does it do to produce these sorts of analyses? What purpose does it serve? Maybe that's something other people would like to argue about. But the final point about engaging with the labor movement and so on, yeah, of course that's important. It's an important thing to do. But it brings to mind, and I've mentioned this before. I apologize if I repeat myself on these streams, but I think, sorry, that's just what's just going to keep happening. It brings to mind Hal Draper's split with the International Socialists, the organization that he was involved with in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, that grew out of his work as a kind of mentor for the New Left during the 60s. And he wrote those articles about the microsect. Essentially, those were his explanation of his decision to leave the International Socialists and to really leave behind a kind of active political life, at least with regard to the sort of sectarian organizations as he characterized them, in favor of doing research and writing on the history of Marxism, and trying to produce what he called a political center for the education of new generations of socialists. And his split with them was largely on this question of the relationship to the labor movement. So there was this, not just in his tendency, but in various other tendencies coming out of the SDS, various Maoist tendencies, as well as other Trotskyist tendencies. There was this notion around the turn of, around 1969, 1970, of the need to industrialize or proletarianize the students that were involved in these New Left organizations, meaning they needed to go to the factories and either, try to, organize the workers directly, from, as kind of outside agitators, or proletarianized in the sense of getting a job in the factory and like seeding unions by salting, by, you know, essentially becoming a worker at a workplace with the intention of unionizing that workplace, and so on. So there, you know, there are various different forms that this took, and Draper's organization, you know, was one of the organizations promoting this, which was their attempt to turn away from what they considered the petty bourgeois movements that were, you know, that made up essentially the new left. So the student movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, these were all seen as petty bourgeois, not in like a, first of all, not in like a pure class sense, as if like everyone involved was like of a different class than the proletariat or something. That's not really what they meant by that. It was more about the political character. So so essentially, it's petty bourgeois in the sense that it may embrace working class people, may embrace wage laborers, but it's not about the specific and distinctive interests of the working class as such. It's about a broader set of, you might say, democratic interests that the proletariat shares with the petty bourgeoisie, or might share with petty bourgeois people. And essentially, it's about sort of reproducing the social, the kind of social order that our society is supposed to be, but that under capitalism it kind of ceases to be. It sort of undermines, you know, you know, democratic rights, right? So like the slaves, the freed slaves were enfranchised by the 14th Amendment or 15th Amendment. I should know which one, but one of those two amendments. They had the right to vote, but then they had to win it back because of the degradation of the revolutionary, you know, advance represented by the Civil War and Reconstruction. You know, same thing with the anti-war movement, right? Like the United States was, in becoming this imperial power, it was degenerating from a republic. So that's kind of the valence when the term imperialism originally, one of the things that represented wasn't like overseas territorial possessions per se, although that's part of it. More significantly, it's about the degeneration of a republic, as in the Roman Republic, into an empire, in the sense of the domination of society by an emperor, but really by the military, and not just the military in the sense of like, you know, like a martial law type scenario, but in the sense that the political leadership of society depends on the exercise of coercive force over the social order in order to maintain it. So essentially, the political order has to hold society together as it's falling apart. That's kind of really the idea. And that has to actually do with class struggles in the Roman Empire, that analogy. But again, that's a digression. So, you know, there is this petty bourgeois character in their eyes, to these movements. And that doesn't count against them per se. But the idea was these kinds of movements can be an asset to the effort to reconstitute a socialist politics. You can work through these movements to that end, but without a foundation in the specifically like the specifically working class movement, in the sense of the wage laborers struggling for their interests as wage laborers that they do not share in common with other classes of society that distinguish them specifically from the capitalist class, but also, you know, most sharply from the capitalist class, but that also creates conflicts with small proprietors and other, you know, professionals and so on. You know, without a foundation in that movement, you are kind of, you're not able to kind of build a serious political organization, with a real kind of, it's kind of not anchored, is one of the ways that they talked about it. Whereas if you have this working class foundation that is then relating to these other movements, that gives it a different valence, because then you can kind of organize like you can kind of organize within these broader petty bourgeois movements on the basis of like an independent proletarian standpoint. And that can exploit divisions within those movements, not in the sense of trying to like split them, but in the sense of contesting for leadership within them, contesting with leadership for leadership within them against the kind of proponents of the prevailing social order that might seek to opportunistically take advantage of them. Go ahead, Glenn.
Well, yeah, finish the Hal Draper thought, and then
Okay, so I was just going to say, in terms of this industrialization, proletarianization, Draper was at odds with his kind of student followers about what the task of the students within the labor movement, the student radicals within the labor movement, would be, and they kind of understood it in terms of, going into the unions to essentially recruit workers to their brand of radical politics, and to regard the existing union leadership with hostility, in the sense that they represented, essentially they represented the capitalist state. They represented this kind of alliance of labor and capital mediated by the state ever since the New Deal. They represented the kind of the loyalty of the unions to the Democratic Party and so on. And Draper's point was, well, it's more complicated than that. The union bureaucrats do represent that, but they also represent the interests of the workers. They're divided between these two conflicting tendencies, and their entire existence is about mediating between these two conflicting kind of forces in society. And the fact that the bureaucracy, the leadership of the unions, has this bureaucratic character is a symptom of the kind of decline and weakness and defensive character of the unions and the labor struggle. So what our task should be to push the union movement forward on its own terms, rather than essentially going in there and trying to recruit the workers directly to our tendency, as if we can build ourselves up into a party that way. And that's kind of the roots of his whole argument about the sect. So it's I don't remember how now this digression has made me lose the train, but maybe you can bring us back to what we were talking about, Clint.
Well, so it's the idea of like pushing the unions forward on their own terms. So I think there's two different issues at play with that. On the one hand, stepping back, we can look and see how, well, organized labor has just become an arm of the imperial corporate state ever since the AFL, and right, ever since the German trade unions subordinate the party and the SPD, and so even though labor itself does have this sort of contradictory position, the organization of labor will either be a racket within capitalism, or it will be potentially the self-organization of the class in the struggle for socialism. And so, like today, right? I mean, people. So you have arguments, because you kind of bring it back to this DSA moment that we're in. There's Matt Huber is saying, well, what we should be doing, we had to identify like the strategic sectors of the economy right now. Mm-hmm. So we really need to be hitting like the already existing unions that make up the electric grid, and you have other people like I forget his name, but basically saying, okay, well, we need to be organizing like the tech workers and the people who like maintain.
Richard Wolff, I think, is that argument.
Richard Wolff may have made it too.
Bhaskar Sankara has made that argument too.
But this is very much the conception. We need to like take all of these PMC intellectuals, these DSA socialists, so to speak, and what they need to be doing is actually going to all of these strategic sectors within the U.S. economy.
Right. Or Kim Moody is who was one of Draper's student followers, I believe, in that period we were just describing, who went on to be, kind of well known for writing this document called the Rank and File Strategy. In I think around 2000, that was published, and that was as he was part of an organization called Solidarity. He was also one of the founders of Labor Notes. You might know of Labor Notes. And in a sense, the rank and file strategy is an expression of the Draperite persuasion of the tendency of the International Socialist kind of tendency or current, which was kind of the merger of Draper's followers with the Cliffites, the followers of Tony Cliff in Great Britain. And then Draper's followers kind of split off and formed this organization, Solidarity. But it doesn't take into account Draper's criticisms when he was leaving the organization. So I'll leave it at that. I want to engage with that in the future in more length. But I want to remember why I brought up Draper and the rank and files strategy and all that. Now I've kind of lost the plot a little bit. Because we were talking about it's important to engage with the existing unions. That's right. So it's, sure, yes, we should, that should be on the agenda, right? If we're serious about building a party. I'm not saying, and I'm not necessarily myself like the best positioned or best equipped to do that kind of work, but I would certainly be very eager to learn about other people trying to do that sort of thing. But Draper's criticism, besides his criticisms of the approach that his followers were taking as a kind of sectarian approach, he was also critical. He was also kind of self-critical in a way of the direction that his group, which started as the Independent Socialist Clubs, and then it developed into the Independent Socialist Committee, I think, and then it became the International Socialists when it merged with the Cliffites. He was kind of self-critical in a way because at the beginning of the 60s, he was just coming out of the Shachtman group, which had merged with the Socialist Party, what was left of the Socialist Party of America. He didn't want to merge with the Socialist Party of America. He thought that was a mistake, and so he split. He kind of backed away at first, and then he explicitly split. I think over something having to do with the Cuban Revolution, if I'm not mistaken. But in any case, so he split with the Shachtmanites, and he started formulating what went wrong, because he joined the Trotskyist movement in the very end of the 30s, and then he ended up going with Shachtman when the Shachtmanites split from the Cannonites, and he was with them all along the way up until the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s. And he kind of represented, I think, so the founders of the Spartacist League, if you know the Spartacist League, Orthodox Trotskyist current that came out of the New Left, they also started their political careers in the Shachtman movement as part of their youth, the Shachtmanites youth organization. And they viewed, Jim Robertson and others viewed Hal Draper as kind of a mentor, as sort of the leader of the left wing of the Shachtman tendency, is the way they describe it. And they ended up splitting from the Shachtmanites as well, and they eventually founded the Spartacist League. But the way they kind of recounted is that, well, they were always waiting for Draper to split and to lead them in a split that would kind of, go in a better direction than the Shachtmanites were headed, and it never happened, right? But Draper did eventually split. And what he tried to do in the early 60s was he tried to figure out what went wrong with the Trotskyist movement. Why didn't it succeed? And because he always thought we had something right, the Shachtmanites, we had something right against Cannon and the Orthodox Trotskyists, but it wasn't adequate, right? So something about our critique was correct, but it wasn't correct enough. We ended up still going in the wrong direction. And so he starts to kind of come up with this idea of forming an educational center as a kind of starting point for a new approach to reconstituting socialist politics. And that's what he starts kind of originally doing in the early 60s. That ends up growing into, as I said, first it grew into the independent socialist clubs, and then ultimately turned into the international socialist tendency. So, or the international socialists. And then in the early 70s, he's kind of like, wait a second, this all started when I was trying to avoid this sectarianism, which is how he kind of understood what went wrong with Trotskyism in terms of Marx's critique of sectarian socialism. Um, so he's like, how did we went down, we ended up in the same place that we were trying to get out of in the first place. Like, we ended up reproducing the same problem that we were trying to overcome, in splitting with Shachtman. So what went wrong? What went wrong? And so that's sort of where his perspective comes out. And his diagnosis in the early 70s is essentially that, the engagements with the real movements are essential and important, but they need to be supported by what he would alternately call an educational center or a political center, essentially a publishing enterprise propagating a, a perspective, a political perspective that represents a distinct conception of socialism, this goal of socialism, the aims of the socialist movement, the relationship of the socialist project to the working class, etc. And there are various forms that this already was taking at the time, and which he was critical of. But he thought, we need that, and we need that in a way that we don't need these sectarian organizations, which exist to do that. They exist to fulfill that function, to educate, to publish, to propagate ideas. They are propaganda groups that exist to keep a certain conception of Marxism or socialism alive, to reproduce it by transmitting it to new generations, and promulgating it among the masses by engaging with the struggles that are going on, that they can intersect, and so on. So that's what the sectarian groups are trying to be. They're trying to do that, but they undermine the function they're trying to fulfill by virtue of their sectarian character. So his idea was basically, we need political centers, and they don't have to all agree. Like, there can be different versions of this that disagree with each other, and that sort of disagreement can be productive and helpful. And the sects prevent that kind of disagreement from happening, which is one of the major problems with them. But we need political centers to support and to help kind of bring together efforts to engage with various forms of struggle in society, whether they be, the struggles of the working class in the workplace, union struggles, or other forms of struggle like the kind of petty bourgeois democratic struggles that the New Left was kind of concerned with. We need these political centers to provide political education and nourishment to people interested in these ideas that can help them think through what they're trying to do and bring them together, but in a way that doesn't involve uniting them into an organization that sort of seals them off intellectually and practically from the rest of the socialist movement, as well as from the working class, in a way that creates this detrimental dynamic where the task of the socialist is, in a sense, to recruit people from the working class into their organization, which has the correct position, and to kind of raise them up to the correct level, rather than what Draper saw Marx as urging, namely, as the Communist Manifesto puts it, to essentially show the workers like the next step of their struggle. I want to pull up the exact formulation, but Clint, I don't know if you have anything to say to that, or if anyone else has come up with has any comments on that.
So I guess so. And one of the, because somebody new listening to this might say, well, isn't that exactly what Jacobin DSA is doing right now? Mm-hmm. We have a publishing center, and we have various activists trying to organize unions, build civic communities, and to get progressives elected. Mm-hmm. And there is a distinct, conception of socialism, and the strategy for socialism, but it's not, but there are various perspectives on it. And so, one of the things that you've been sort of fleshing out here is how even that has the same sort of sectarian character, besides being a means end sort of issue that Draper is already beginning to see with this rank and file, bringing socialism to the working class kind of moment. But at the same time, the other side of it, the other side of the coin is, if I'm just an idealistic, young socialist in the DSA, what if like the real movement of the working class, isn't pointing to socialism? Don't they have to be told? Isn't there like, don't we have to bring these ideas?
Now you've done it, Clint. Now you've done it. Now you're going to make me read a long passage from Engels.
Very good, very good. If the real movement of the working class just is these corporate unions who are just negotiating labor contracts, and that's all it is, then there has to be some idealistic missionary coming in and saying, no, your life is more than this. All right. Hit us with the quote. And people in the chat,
I'm going to read a couple.
Okay, read a couple of quotes, and people in the chat, y'all should post some questions.
Yeah, well, and I saw
after these quotes,
I think there was a question from. Okay, so we'll get to those questions in a moment. Okay, sorry, but I am going to indulge myself, and hopefully you'll indulge me in reading a few things that, at least one of which I'm sure probably almost everyone who is watching or will watch this has already read. But I find myself in the habit of rereading the Communist Manifesto, or at least parts of the Communist Manifesto, on almost a daily basis, which maybe speaks more to my my own sort of obsessiveness or something than anything else. But I just always find it so instructive to return to it. So I apologize for the indulgence. But so this is from the second chapter of the Communist Manifesto. The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. Well, on that line, that is a formulation that, as Marx and Engels themselves recognize subsequently, was specific to the moment in which the manifesto was produced, namely that there had not developed the working class movement hadn't developed to the point that a split between an explicitly communist expression of the working class, the working class's political arm would emerge, right? So at this point there isn't a kind of separate party of the communists. The communists are a tendency in the broader working class movement. That's not to say they always have to be, there only can ever be a single political organization of the working class that the communists have to remain within. Okay, so sorry for that stupid little excursus, but I kind of walked myself into that. I didn't really intend to read that line. Okay, but the communists have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from other working class parties by this only. In the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. And in the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. That's the point I meant to emphasize here. The most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. Pushes forward. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. So, one thing I wanted to say here, I reread this all the time, and I'm reading it to you now because this is, like, I think the entirety of the Communist Manifesto and many of the things Marx wrote that are, relatively commonly read. This is something that it's very easy to sort of glaze over as you're reading it, and it doesn't necessarily sink in what he's saying, specifically because the context he's writing within and for is just doesn't exist for us. So you either just kind of bracket the context and try to make sense of these statements on their own terms, which is sort of, it's not an abstract piece of reasoning, right? So reading it that way is already something that Marx and Engels would criticize in the next chapter of this, let alone elsewhere. But also, or otherwise, you may try to like make sense of it in terms of the world we live in now. But it's really, I think, if you really kind of understand this in the context in which it was written, what they're saying here. And so I think I'll clarify a little bit what I'm trying to get at in the next two things I'm going to read. But this is a very different conception of communism. First of all, from what most people think communism means, what communism meant for most people for most of the 20th century. But also what communism and socialism meant to other socialists before Marx and Engels, and even, at the same time, until really the end of the 19th century, like the second, really the kind of last quarter or so of the 19th century, when the Marxist conception, scientific socialism, what became the dominant tendency. So let me read another thing here. This is a passage from Engels's History of the Communist League, a little kind of essay that he wrote to reflect on the history of the Communist League after the fact. So the discovery which revolutionized the science of history, and as we have seen, is essentially the work of Marx, a discovery in which I can claim for myself only a very insignificant share, was, however, of immediate importance for the contemporary workers' movement. Communism among the French and Germans, Chartism among the English, now no longer appeared as something accidental, which could just as well not have occurred. These movements now presented themselves as a movement of the modern oppressed class, the proletariat, as the more or less developed forms of its historically necessary struggle against the ruling class, the bourgeoisie. As forms of the class struggle, but distinguished from all earlier class struggles by this one thing, that the present day oppressed class, the proletariat, cannot achieve its emancipation without at the same time emancipating society as a whole from division into classes, and therefore from class struggles. And communism now no longer meant the concoction by means of the imagination of an ideal society as perfect as possible, but insight into the nature, conditions, and the consequent general aims of the struggle waged by the proletariat. So, in essence, so let me back up a second. So, in the manifesto, they say the aims of the communists aren't any different from the rest of the working class, political side of the working class movement, the working class parties. As I've said before, it was kind of taken for granted that if you're organizing a working class political party, the reason you're doing that is to take political power, and to take political power on the basis of your distinct interests as a class. Now, whether or not those distinct interests are understood as fundamentally incompatible with and irreconcilable with those of the capitalist class and with the perpetuation of capitalist production indefinitely, and hence the necessity of overcoming capitalism. Um, that's not how everyone involved in, for example, the Chartist movement thought about it. But they all agreed that the reason we're engaging in politics is because we're trying to take power as a party, organized as a party, and a party representing our class. So the notion that you would have like a working class politics that's just trying to be like an influence, a kind of pressure group essentially on, you know, on whatever is the ruling party. I mean, it raises questions to say the least. So how in doing that are you actually building independent power, in the sense of, you know, how are you posing yourself as an opposition that is to replace the existing rulers rather than as a base of support for them, right? Um, so it's not like as if what Marx represents is unique in the sense of like Marx's conception of the role of socialist intellectuals in the labor movement. His conception wasn't like unique in the sense that the workers hadn't thought about organizing politically to take power before. No, they already were doing that. And he was, in a sense, reflecting on why they were doing that. And he saw the importance of socialist ideas for the working class as, given their popularity amongst the working class movement and including amongst the political, side of the working class movement amongst the Chartists, the workers involved in the Chartist movement. The significance of these socialist ideas was it was an attempt by the workers to think through why they needed to take political power. Why was this necessary? So what was it that was wrong with the existing social order that made it necessary for them to take power? And what is it that they were going to do once they had power that would change that? That is what the relevance of these socialist ideas was for the working class movement. And so what Engels is getting at here is what is unique to Marx among socialists, because this is not how the socialists themselves, in the sense of the kind of socialist intellectuals that had their own movements devoted to their ideas. This is not how any of them thought about what they were doing, right? None of the socialist intellectuals, from the kind of original utopian socialists to those that were contemporary with Marx and Engels in this period, like Proudhon, none of them thought about socialism in terms of the working class taking political power. And the working class, the Chartists, for example, did think about taking political power, but they weren't uniformly trying to like institute some or another conception of socialism. And socialism at this time meant, so Engels puts it here, the concoction by means of the imagination of an ideal society as perfect as possible. But to be a little bit more charitable, it meant essentially the rational reorganization of society in the interests of everyone. So in the interests of like the full development of each individual, the happiness and freedom of in each individual in society. And in that sense, what the socialist intellectuals, the utopian socialists, were trying to do with their ideas was capture what the bourgeois revolutionary transformation of society had held out as the reason society exists at all, and the kind of natural purpose of society, that this revolutionary transformation was reinstating, restoring, after a millennia of this kind of imposition of irrational and unnatural forms of social order, slavery and feudalism and all this sort of stuff. So the bourgeois revolutions conceived of themselves as restoring this natural essence of social life, which was that individuals would cooperate with each other in order to fully develop their capacities in their interrelations with each other, and their voluntary interrelations with each other. And as a result, they would allow themselves and each other and the society as a whole to fully develop its capacities, and to fully, as it were, pursue its happiness, whatever forms of happiness it wanted, and for that matter, to continuously invent new needs to satisfy and new forms of happiness to pursue. So, that was what the bourgeois revolutions had promised. And the socialists were, in a sense, responding to a crisis in this form of society that had emerged with the Industrial Revolution, that this society was no longer apparently adequate to that goal in this kind of transformation that had been occurring with the Industrial Revolution. But at the same time, the change that was occurring with the rise of large-scale industry indicated the possibility of the transformation of society at a more fundamental level, right? So there's a sense in which society is changing itself unconsciously in a way that does not accord with our rational conception of what society should be like. But because we have the capacity as a society to change it ourselves, to change our social order, our social relations, because we have the capacity to do that unconsciously, we also could do it consciously. And so the goal of these Robert Owen and Saint-Simon and these figures was to say, what if we undertook the rational reconstruction, the rational transformation of social life, instead of allowing it to happen unconsciously? What if we did it consciously? And that is essentially what the working class movement saw as, that's what they saw in the socialist intellectuals and these ideas. They saw we need to undertake that task of consciously transforming society, or put otherwise, of taking conscious control, conscious direction, conscious responsibility for this process of transformation that's already unfolding and that's undermining our freedom, undermining our happiness, undermining our conditions of life, but that could emancipate us, that could become the basis of a more profound emancipation than even the bourgeois revolutions were able to promise. So that was essentially Marx's recognition. The historic role of the socialist and communist ideas, although it wasn't obvious in their origins, it became obvious with the emergence of the proletarian socialist movement and the political struggle of the working class. It became obvious what the purpose of these socialist ideas was, which was to clarify this historic task of the proletariat. And for that matter, while the proletariat was already struggling for political power, Marx's conception of socialism and the way in which Marx tries to, what Marx is trying to do in his kind of critical socialism within the working class movement is to help clarify for the working class why it is necessary to take political power, what makes that necessary, right? So this idea that what is socialism? It's the abolition of private property, and it's the replacement of private property with social property. It's the socialization of property. It's the expropriation of private property, the private property of the capitalists, and the institution of a socialized system of production under democratic control, and so on and so on. These formulations, it's not that those are wrong, but the point for Marx is, well, but that's just what capitalism is already doing. It's already changing society in that direction. But society, because it is not conscious of this process of transformation, in the sense of it's not undertaking this process of change intentionally, society regards this process of change as a crisis that needs to be, in a sense, prevented or resisted or contained in one way or another. the entire basis of society is individual property, the property of the individual laborer and the product of his labor. That's what bourgeois social relations are based on. And capitalism, as this collectivization and socialization of the labor process of production, is undermining that. So society regards this as a crisis, and that manifests in the expropriation of the workers of property and their labor, their proletarianization. Individual workers are no longer able to live on the basis of their labor as individuals. They can only live as essentially parts of the collective laborer constituted by this social production process that capital, in a sense, is. Right? So capital is like the collectivization of their labor that they confront as an alien force outside of them that's destroying the basis of their life, that's oppressing them, that's preventing them from experiencing the freedom that they supposedly have, that transforms their freedom into a form of slavery, that turns the pursuit of happiness into drudgery, and so on. Okay, so one more thing, and then we'll go to the questions. And this is a little bit longer, I apologize, but just bear with me. So all modern revolutions, beginning with the English Revolution, and this is from Engels' Introduction to the Class Struggles in France, which he wrote in the 1890s. It's one of the last things he wrote, and really one of the most important things that I think either he or Marx wrote. It's also the locus of a controversy in the Second International, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. All modern revolutions, beginning with the Great English Revolution of the 17th century, exhibited these features which seem inseparable from every revolution. And the features he's talking about are essentially in every bourgeois revolution and every revolution before, it was a minority that made the revolution, and they made the revolution with the support of the masses, the majority. But they made it in order to, as a minority, take power away from the minority that already had power. So one class sought to replace the existing ruling class and become a ruling class in its place, but to become a ruling class in the interests of the majority. And the reason it always had this pattern is because in all prior history, it was never possible for the majority of people to rule themselves. The majority of people were essentially dependent on rulers. And so the question was, what was the form that their dependency and that the rule over them was going to take? And so historical development for Marx takes the form of certain forms of social order, of rule, of the kind of organization of this dependency relationship between ruling minorities and working or oppressed majorities, developing from more primitive forms to more advanced forms. And the most advanced form is the bourgeois revolution, in which it's still a minority revolution, but it opens up the possibility of going beyond this pattern. Okay. So, and in a conscious way, right? So it's not just, like one group of nobles exploiting peasant revolts or slave revolts to install themselves in power in the place of the other nobles, right? It's a fundamentally different pattern where the promise of the majority of people, the working masses, the toiling masses, the third estate, taking power was kind of consciously inscribed into the revolutionary process itself. But nonetheless, it was under the leadership of minorities. And once this minority takes power, the pattern in these revolutions is that the minority that takes power splits between one faction that's satisfied with the achievements of the revolution and another faction that seeks to push the revolution forward even further. And so this pattern is exhibited by the English Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. And ultimately, the way this kind of plays out is that the right-wing faction, if you will, ends up. So the left-wing faction, in a sense, goes too far and discredits itself, undermines itself, leaving the right-wing faction in power, but then the right-wing faction ends up undermining itself because it was, in a sense, it was necessary to continue pushing the revolution forward in order to consolidate what the revolution had won. And so then you have a period of reaction that sort of preserves the gains of the revolution in spite of the revolutionary movement. And then you have a correction where a kind of more moderate regime comes. So you have, in the English Revolution, you have, Cromwell, the Civil War, Cromwell takes power. Then you have the reaction, the restoration of the Stuarts, and then you have the Glorious Revolution. In the French Revolution, you have, the Jacobin period. Then you have first you have Napoleon, and then you have the restoration of the Bourbons, and then you have Louis Philippe, and you have the bourgeois monarchy, and so on. Same thing with the American Revolution. You have the original revolutionary process, then you have Hamilton and the Federalists, and then you have Jefferson. And for that matter, you could also look at the same pattern with the Second American Revolution. I'm sorry, I'm digressing, but some interesting, I think, important stuff. Okay, so let me actually get to what I meant to talk about. At all the more modern revolutions, beginning with the Great English Revolution of the 17th century, exhibited these features, which seem inseparable from every revolutionary struggle. They appear applicable also to the struggles of the proletariat for its emancipation. Applicable the more so, since just in 1848, those could be counted who even in a measure understood in which direction emancipation was to be looked for. The proletarian masses themselves, even after their Paris victory, were absolutely at sea as to the course to be pursued. And yet, there was the movement, instinctive, spontaneous, irrepressible. Was not that just the situation wherein the revolution must succeed, led by a minority? Was not that just the situation wherein the revolution must succeed, led by a minority, it is true, but this time not in the interests of that minority, but in the most specific interest of the majority? If in all the longer revolutionary periods, the great popular masses were so easily won over by the merely plausible lures of the forward-pushing minorities, why should they be less accessible to ideas that were the very reflex of their economic condition? Let me repeat that. Why should they be less accessible to ideas that were the very reflex of their economic condition? So these ideas are they're not coming from without in the sense that they are, being opportunistically exploited by some minority that seeks to use them, to take power for themselves. There is, in a sense, a minority from without, but the minority from without is articulating ideas that are the reflex of their economic condition, right? So this necessity is intrinsic to the kind of position of the working class in society, even if it's not consciously grasped as such by workers, automatically. It only kind of becomes explicit through the development of their struggle to the point that it becomes a political struggle. That's where it begins to become explicit. And that's precisely where the socialist ideas enter, right? That's where you get the fusion of the socialist movement and the working class movement, the merger. If in all the longer revolutionary period, true, this revolutionary disposition, this revolutionary disposition of the masses had most always, and often very soon, made way for lassitude, or even a reversal into its opposite, as soon as the illusion had been dispelled and disenchantment had come. But here was not a case of lures, but one of the attainment of the very interests of the great majority itself. Interests then by no means clear to that majority, but which soon had to become clear through convincing demonstrations in the course of their realization. And if then, as shown in the third article of Marx in the spring of 1850, developments had concentrated the real ruling power in the bourgeois republic that had emanated from the social revolution of 1848 in the hands of the big bourgeoisie, which, on top of all, entertained monarchistic desires, which all other social classes, peasants as well as petty bourgeoisie, had been grouped about the proletariat in such a manner that in case, and after a common victory, not the bourgeoisie, but the proletariat, made wary by experience, would become the decisive factor. In such case, were not the chances favorable for a reversion of the revolution of the minority into the revolution of the majority? History has proved us wrong, and all others who thought similarly. It is made clear that the status of economic development on the continent was then by no means ripe for the abolition of capitalist production. I'll skip forward a little bit. But it was just this industrial revolution that has everywhere introduced clarity in regard to class relations, which has eliminated a mass of hybrid forms taken over from the period of manufacture, etc. Thereby has the struggle between these two great classes, which in 1848 existed outside of England only in Paris and perchance in a few large industrial centers, been spread over the whole of Europe and has attained an intensity unthinkable in 1848. We had then the many vague sectarian evangels with their panaceas. We have today the one universally accepted, transparently clear theory of Marx, sharply formulating the final purposes of the struggle. We had then the masses, divided and differentiated according to locality and nationality, undeveloped, held together only by a sense of common suffering, aimlessly driven hither and thither between enthusiasm and despair. We have today the one great international army of socialists, advancing irresistibly, daily growing in numbers, organization, discipline, discernment, and certainty of victory. And if this powerful army of the proletariat has not yet reached the goal, if far from winning the victory by one fell blow, it must gradually proceed by hard, tenacious struggle from position to position, it proved once for all how impossible it was in 1848 to bring about the social transformation by a sheer coup de main. Okay, so I'm sorry that was quite long, but I hope you see the point which I came at the end there. Namely, that what we have with Marx is a conscious grasp of what unfolded from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution until 1848 in the form of a coherent theory, which is to say, a coherent grasp of the historical process that was then taken up consciously as the guiding, directing vision of this one united international army of socialists advancing irresistibly towards victory, right? So that is the role of socialism. That is the role of socialism understood as, Marx understood it in this scientific sense, this critical grasp of the historical process that socialism itself as a set of ideas, a movement of various different heterogeneous ideas, was a part. Marx's kind of critical socialism is a clarification of this process and its ultimate necessary endpoint, which is the conquest of political power by the proletariat and the conscious direction of the economic transformation that is already unfolding under capitalism, but in a self-contradictory, self-undermining, self-defeating way that continuously restores the very conditions that it then subsequently undermines and destroys over and over again. Okay, sorry about the length of that.
That was excellent. But so the real movement of labor is just the historical movement of society,
right?
that it's actually labor reconstituting itself self-contradictorily as capital. Exactly. And that's what has to be brought to historical consciousness via organization, practice, theory.
Capital. What is capital? Capital is the working class that has not yet organized itself consciously as the ruling class. That's what it is. It is the working class. It's the embodiment of their labor in a material form, in the form of the stuff that we can be referred to as capital goods, means of production, but also commodities more generally, and as well as the commodity labor power itself, right? Which is, of course, itself a form of capital, variable capital. But what is capital? Capital is the working class relating to itself as an alien force. It's relating to its own activity, constitutive of society, as an alien force dominating it. And the point would be for the working class to become conscious of its unconscious role in constituting society in this contradictory way, and to take conscious responsibility for that process. I wrote this on Twitter the other day, or it may have been earlier today. What is the dictatorship of the proletariat? It is capital become conscious of itself as self-contradictory. It's capital that has rendered itself conscious of its as a self-contradiction of society, and working through that self-contradiction instead of continuously undermining itself and reconstituting itself in this kind of endless cycle of crisis and
so
on.
To come back to these two thinkers I had in view for in and around the DSA. So one saying that we need to critically, we need to organize the strategic strategic sectors of the working class organized already in unions or putting them in unions, right? So we've got the electric grid, the physical structure of the internet, and the way that they're both thinking about this is in terms of like the capitalist class, right? So you have you have fossil capital and you have like the internet capital, and they're both just trying to like maximize their profits by exploiting labor. So how do we, the view is that like the working class is actually the object of this like extraneous, capitalist class force, which is, so it's like, therefore, it's a libertarian or it's a right-wing argument to say that, well, the capitalists are just organizing labor. And so like both sides, so you easily miss how both sides of those are actually true and false. That the capitalist is just like the organization of labor, but he's also the exploitation of labor. So how do we understand like the class conflict between like the fossil capitalists as they're called, and like the working class as this is that which both constitutes fossil capital, and is also extraneous to it, is also superfluous with respect to it.
So this term fossil capital, I've not heard that before, but But just the idea that the capitalists are
oil.
Like,
no.
Oh, okay, like
oil
fossil
extraction.
fuels.
Yeah, like fossil fuels, because everybody's thinking about this ecologically now.
Okay.
So it's like so it's the oil industry, and like because which is we're still a pretty long way out from transitioning to like a green economy right now. But those who are thinking about this as a class relation, it is about how we're exploiting labor for super profits.
Right. Well, so the capitalist class, especially really since, let's say since the latter half of the 19th century, maybe you could even say since 1848, but however you want to periodize it, the capitalist class has been becoming increasingly superfluous, in a way that the capitalist has a certain historical necessity for Marx, right? They have a necessary historical function, which is essentially raising the working class to the point where it becomes both possible and necessary for them to take up this conscious struggle for power, and then, having taken power, directing this process consciously. So there is like a progressive function of the capitalist, but it's sort of it's not like a long-term necessity, right? It is kind of a passing necessity, but it's one that is continuously reproduced also, right? So we still need the capitalists, but we also don't really need them, right? We could be done with them, but because we're not done with them, we still need them, right? So Marx has this way of talking about it in the third volume of Capital, of like the capitalists are increasingly reduced to, essentially rentiers collecting interest on investments, and the sort of functions the capitalists had as entrepreneurs, as like business owners that oversaw the organization of production directly, as like the managers of the production process, or as like the head of the management of the production process. That function has been divorced from the function of the capitalist, so that now you have essentially paid employees performing those functions, who are themselves workers, although in a kind of compromised position, but at least potentially could be won over to the class struggle. They're not like going to be your base of, they're not going to be the core of the struggle, but just like the petty bourgeoisie and professionals, you would want to win over as many of them as you could. But the kind of pure function of the capitalist is reduced to collecting interest on an investment, right? So in a sense, it's this kind of pure expropriation of like surplus value, not as a function of, well, okay, I don't want to get into the weeds here. That's a topic for another time. But so the point basically is that this function, you don't need a separate classes of people to fulfill this function. The working class could oversee the production of a surplus over and above whatever they decide is necessary for their the level of subsistence they want to have. The reason we still have capitalists is because the workers go out there and look for jobs. That's why there's capitalists. I mean, there are in some circles you'll hear kind of these fantasies of like, it has roots in like the old concept of the general strike, going back to the pre-Chartist English working class movement. But you'll have these people that are like, we should all, we should end work. I forget, there's like a hashtag, anti-work or something like that. This idea that if we all just stopped going to work, it would, we could, change society or something. And there's like a version of this in like the communization people and stuff like that as well. We could just be done with the capitalists. And there is a kernel of truth to that, right? Because the only reason that capitalist industries are able to function is because they're able to employ workers to do the work, right? That's the essence of if you don't have workers, you can have all the machines you want, but they're not going to replace human labor, because the production system is still built upon people doing things as much as you supplement it with automated systems, right? Now, could you ever reach a point where there's a completely automated system that doesn't require any human inputs? I mean, that's like a weird science fiction scenario that's pretty far flung. And also, it's kind of hard to imagine the social circumstances in which both that would become possible and necessary. But as a necessary kind of intermediate step, you would have to have a situation in which nobody needed to seek employment to live anymore, right? So, this idea of like fully automated luxury communism, some people bat around, is sort of another version of this. But it's kind of weird to think that like what people under the dictatorship of the proletariat would decide to do would be to live in kind of would be to develop a completely autonomous production system that they don't have to interact with at all, and that everyone can just kind of sit around and watch TV or whatever, or whatever, play video games. That's sort of the vision. More likely, what you would do is you would have a collapse of the distinction between necessary activity and desirable activity, such that you no longer need to eventually you get to a point where you no longer need to pay people to do the things that need to be done. And that would, of course, involve a great deal of automation, probably. But it wouldn't, there's, anyway, I'm getting, again, sorry, I digress a lot, but there's so much to think about here. Clint, I feel like I've gone a little far afield of the point you were asking me about, so I don't know if you want to try to.
No, that gets directly. I mean, they gets directly at it. Seeing because the capitalist class is also proletarianized, right? It's just as superfluous as the working class with respect to bourgeois social relations of labor,
right?
And that it's that deeper historical contradiction of labor with itself. It's out of that we're getting this class conflict, but also just kind of riffing off of what you were talking about there, technical innovation or technological advancement. This is very much a social product. It's coming out of the division and the cooperation of labor. From Adam Smith all the way even into today. This isn't like because people will say, oh, well, you need like the capitalist as like a person who's like innovative. It's like, no, this is precisely the cooperation of labor and the accumulation of and implementation of knowledge that is like innovative, so to speak. And so understand, go back to what you were kind of pointing out earlier, like the whole point of the DOP, the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, transitioning to socialism is precisely to release those dynamic capacity, those dynamic capacities, what they used to call the forces of production, mastering our relation to nature, so to speak, so that we don't have to, dominate ourselves and nature, so to speak. And so so releasing the productive forces in that way, because they're actually held back by a superfluous,
by an antiquated form of social organization, which is bourgeois social relations of labor.
Right.
Which is not to say that they can simply be abolished. They have to be worked through and transcended on their own basis, right? Transformed, on their own basis. It's not a matter of simply like getting rid of them and starting from scratch. It's a matter of changing them into something else. But you have to decide to do that, right? And that's a question of consciously deciding to transform society in its totality, which is politics, right? That's why it becomes a question of politics. So it's not just about the foundation of society, like in the sense of people talk about it as like the economic foundation of society. It is that. So Doug Lane, from Sublation Media, has this kind of hobby horse that he always beats whenever this question of the politics of of the rule of the working class come up. He always has to make this point of, well, you would need to change the production system. You would need to, change commodity production and abolish value and all this sort of stuff, which, yes. But the point is that capitalism already is doing that. That's what capitalism is, right? Capitalism is the self-undermining dynamic of commodity production. It's commodity production transforming itself into something else, but in a way that when it gets to the threshold of transformation, society regards that as a crisis that it cannot consciously see through, so that the result of the crisis is some sort of breakdown that then creates the stage for the reproduction, the reconstitution of the thing that was being undermined in the first place, right? So that's the point. The point would be to take conscious responsibility for this dynamic, which isn't to say that when the working class takes power, everything just automatically resolves itself. No, it would be a sustained period of political struggle around how to see through this process. But it would be a conscious political problem instead of this unconscious background, right? And so seeing through that necessary change that's emanating from the foundation of society, and in a sense, rising up through the entire superstructure of society, disturbing and undermining and otherwise unsettling all of the everything in the entire structure of society, you need to kind of approach that problem from the standpoint of the totality, from the standpoint not simply of the economic foundation, but from the standpoint of the social totality, the entire structure of society, base and superstructure, right? Foundation and everything built on that foundation. It all has to change. It all has to change together, or none of it will change. It will simply collapse and then be rebuilt on the same basis, right? So that's the point about politics. That's why it's always ultimately a political problem and not simply an economic problem. Okay, so before we finish, so Stephen Roberts, who's been a very consistent, commentator on these streams and also on Twitter and so on, has posed a number of comments and questions, and I want to get to them, or at least raise them. We can't address them satisfactorily, because he certainly deserves credit for always sticking with us and participating. So he says, Reese shortcuts, and I'm sorry if we've passed by these points. Hopefully we can kind of recall what this was initially responding to. Reese shortcuts, a principled, rigorous intellectual vanguard needed, clearly. Connection to the masses, embark on organizing for struggle somewhere on the long front between workers and capital, which constitutes our society, quoting that article we discussed earlier. Ambiguity needing discussion, strategy, tactics, ? And strikes, walkouts, struggles for union recognition, and struggles for union democracy indicates an overly probably strong emphasis on workplace struggles with not enough critique of the last 120 years of trade unionism and reformist politics generally. Okay, that's something to consider. Could Reed explain the essential difference between his own understanding of a socialist party and the possibility of one today, and that suggested by the author, tough but try? Okay, so let me say one thing. So he refers to it as a revolutionary party, right? Which I don't have a problem with per se. I mean, I definitely agree that what is needed is a revolutionary party. I am a little tentative about that formulation, not in its essence, but in its valence in the present. I think the author, I think it's this article, it might have been something else I just read, makes a point. So sorry if this is not in that article, it might be somewhere else, but I thought it was in this article. Makes a point that it shouldn't be difficult to create a revolutionary party in a country that was founded by a revolutionary party and that was led by a revolutionary party in a crisis namely the Civil War, that led to essentially the refoundation of the country. So twice over, the United States was led by revolutionary parties. It's in our blood, so to speak. Metaphorically, of course. And wearing the American flag shirt today. In that sense, there shouldn't really be a problem with an appeal to revolution, right? Revolutionary politics. Nonetheless, I think emphasizing revolution is a little bit maybe not. It's not what I would emphasize at present, at least not in all company, right? In all contexts. So when Draper talks about the political center, he talks about how, on the one hand, what Marx was recommending was a full exposition of the theory, unmitigated, right? So you don't conceal our views, right? The communists don't conceal our views. We say the whole of what we understand, by what our perspective encompasses, right? This entire historical conception of the conditions and the ultimate aims of the struggle of the working class. But on the other hand, in engaging with the movement, so that's on the theoretical level, but on the practical level, engaging with the real movement, we don't oppose ourselves to the real movement in the sense of like opposing where it is with what it ultimately has to do, like as if to say, you're wrong for not, organizing as a political party and trying to make a revolution or something like that. The point is to push the movement forward from wherever it is to the next step, the next stage of development of its struggle, because that struggle ultimately points in the direction of that necessity. That doesn't mean it automatically culminates in the realization of that necessity, because of this self-undermining dynamic we were just describing. The working class movement is just as much a part of capitalism as anything else. And in a sense, it is the essence of capitalism, the working class movement. And that's why, with the absence of a working class movement for socialism, you get questions about whether it's even coherent to continue describing society as capitalism, right? So this was more prominent in like the 70s and 80s, post-industrial society, these other kinds of conceptions of like, maybe it doesn't make sense to talk about this society as capitalism anymore. But anyway, so there is this, there is this kind of intrinsic tendency in that direction, that it's the goal of Marxists engaging with the working class movement to help guide the movement in the direction of recognizing that necessity, and in a sense, coming to grasp the significance of this theoretical perspective, right? But that doesn't mean that you go into the unions and give them the Communist Manifesto and say, here, read this, and then we'll talk, right? That's not at all the point. So when Marx and Engels were involved in the formation of the First International, and Marx wrote the kind of the general rules of the First International. First International was made up of, relatively moderate British trade unionists, French Proudhonists, various other tendencies in other countries, most of whom, if not all of whom, were quite far from Marx's perspective, right? At least in some respects, if not in all respects. So I think I have to go in a moment, but let me just wrap up this thought. So they formulated the rules of the First International in a way that stated their perspective as plainly as possible, but without but with doing so in a way that would be amenable to these various different tendencies, that would not raise their hackles, right? So I think the way either Marx or Engels puts it in a letter to the other, we were not at that point capable of the old boldness of speech, as in the kind of formulations in the Communist Manifesto, because they weren't in this kind of peak revolutionary moment where there was this enthusiasm and expectation of revolution and this kind of mobilization of the masses for revolutionary change. It was a much lower moment in terms of the level of development of the class struggle, kind of recuperating from the defeats of 1848 and the period of counter-revolution in the 1850s. So they had to sort of dial back the way they formulated their perspective, but the essence of their perspective is still there. Namely, and this is what Hal Draper calls the principle of self-emancipation, that the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class, the workers themselves. The workers must win their own emancipation by their own act, rather than, so this is this conception of the majority revolution, right? The workers must lead the majority, the masses, to win their own emancipation. And ultimately the masses will be encompassed into the proletariat, even at that time when they weren't necessarily the majority in every country, or any country except England, and even in England, barely. So, there is this dynamic that of kind of progressive development of the struggle in the direction of the necessity of revolution that must be encouraged from whatever point you're starting at. And so I wouldn't necessarily formulate it as we need a revolutionary party at present. I mean, I might. It depends on the context. That isn't to say I don't think we need a revolutionary party. I do. But the point is less about, immediately. The most immediate concern is not that the party needs to be revolutionary so much as that it needs to be an independent expression of the class struggle of the workers, a political expression of the class struggle of the workers, an expression of the independent interests of the workers as a class. So not sectional interests or national interests, but the interests of all wage laborers and all people who may at some point become wage laborers. So it's in essence everybody, but more in a more limited sense, people that already have to sell their labor power to live, or people that are maybe temporarily exempt from that necessity, but may or may not, face it, at some point. And, small proprietors who maybe lose the property that they have and have to become wage laborers and so on. So in a sense, the various different elements of society all are threatened with precipitation into the proletariat. And in that sense, it's this kind of majoritarian conception. Okay, I just want to finish by reading these last comments of Steve Roberts, and then we'll end it. Historical specificity required while listening to these quotes. Okay, what Reed is describing reflects the present left romanticism and moralizing. They essentially see it as sufficient creditable to replicate the socialism of the Chartists, etc., adjusted for today's society. So regressive. Yes. Yes. But I mean, the thing is, it's not just contemporary socialists who are regressed. Like, society is regressed. So in a sense, a regressed consciousness is simply an expression of the condition of society more generally. Society is regressed in the sense that what I was saying, describing earlier, is kind of like the core of capitalism, the working class movement, disintegrated and has not significantly recuperated from that disintegration since it began unfolding. And it's only deepened. So, of course, the consciousness has gone with it. I say, of course, it's not as if that couldn't have been overcome. Maybe it could have been overcome, but it wasn't. Not in any kind of substantial way. Maybe there are kernels of like that original consciousness that have been held on to as kind of messages in a bottle. But even to the extent that that's true, those of us that are trying to kind of decipher those, kind of missives from history are not exactly facing an easy task, because it's not even easy to make sense of this stuff if you dedicate yourself to trying to do so, let alone to kind of promulgate what you're learning from this history in an effective way. And this whole thing I'm doing here is my very ham-fisted attempt to figure out how to do that. Right. In many ways, we are trailing behind the consciousness of the Chartists and other early socialists, certainly. And we have to kind of work through that. And that's why I think it's important to criticize DSA, this DSA perspective. It's important to do this, not because we're going to kind of necessarily convert these people or something. Some of them maybe, I don't know. That's not necessarily what I'm trying to do here. But because, to whatever extent possible, the errors of present day socialists that reflect an inability to grasp this history, a lack of historical consciousness, have to themselves be rendered conscious. And that can only be done in light of this history. So, that's at least that's the modest contribution I can make to this project of building a revolutionary party, a socialist party, a proletarian party, however you want to formulate it. That's what I'm trying to do. And, hopefully that will play some positive role in the future. But that's all I have to say. I don't know if you have any last thoughts.
Thanks, Reed. We'll see each other next week.
All right, great.
All right, see y'all. Take care.